From afar, the executive watched, paralyzed. The shock was palpable, a knot in his throat, not of remorse, but of pure disbelief. She wasn't devoured. Instead of being prey, his mother had found a wild protector, a force of nature that he, in his calculating coldness, could never have foreseen or overcome. The bear now seemed to stand guard, an imposing warm shadow beside the woman, while the son, the true monster, felt the psychological dread of a fate he could not control. The scene unfolded before the executive's eyes like a surreal nightmare, a horror film where the victim refused to follow the script. The bear, that colossal beast he had expected to be the final executioner, was now kneeling, a massive brown giant of dense fur and tense muscles, yet with a delicacy that defied all logic. His mother, once a burden, a blemish on his impeccable plan, was now the center of a wild, protective attention. The animal's rough tongue, which he had imagined tearing flesh, glided over the open wound on her leg. It wasn't an attack, it was a cleaning. Each lick was precise, methodical, removing the blood that had previously flowed freely, washing away the forest dirt that had contaminated the cut. The sound, muffled by the distance, was almost a murmur, a sound of care that brutally contrasted with the icy silence the sun had imposed. A shiver ran down the executive's spine, not from cold, but from the grotesque inversion of roles. He, the predator, the calculating one, was now on the sidelines, a mere spectator of a brutal miracle. Disbelief slowly transformed into a corrosive nausea. He had planned every detail, every step to rid himself of that burden, that living memory of a past he wanted to erase. And now, nature itself, in its most untamed form, was undoing his work. The bear, after cleaning the wound with a patience he would never demonstrate, began to sniff the ground. Its enormous head moved from side to side until its powerful claws began to scrape the damp earth. The executive watched, his breath caught in his throat. What would come next? A macabre burial? But no. The bear gathered a handful of dark, rich mud in its front paws. With the same surgical precision, it applied the cold paste over the freshly cleaned wound. A thick, protective layer, like a primitive poultice covering the cut, sealing it against the outside world. It wasn't just a cleaning, it was a dressing, a healing. His mother, previously prostrate, seemed to have found renewed strength in the animal's presence. Her eyes, once filled with pain and abandonment, now watched the bear with a mixture of awe and an almost reverent stillness. There was no fear in them, only a silent acceptance, a surrender to that wild force that had chosen to protect her. And the executive, the son who abandoned her, felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, not from an earthquake, but from the seismic shift in his own reality. His meticulously crafted plan crumbled to dust. His mother would not only survive, she was being cared for, protected by a creature he, in his arrogance, considered inferior. The bear now sat beside her, a mountain of fur and muscle, watching the forest with attentive eyes. It was no longer a wild animal. It was a guardian, an imposing warm shadow, a living symbol of a justice he could not comprehend, much less control. The psychological fear that engulfed him was unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't the fear of being caught, of being punished by human law. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the fear of disorder, of the chaos settling into his perfectly ordered universe. He had underestimated his mother's resilience, nature's unpredictability. He had played a game whose rules he didn't understand. The forest, once a silent accomplice to his crime, now seemed to mock him. Every rustle of leaves, every bird's song, seemed to echo the irony of his situation. He, the ruthless businessman, the architect of destinies, was now powerless, watching his own ruin unfold. The bear, the beast that should have consumed his mother, had become the instrument of her salvation and, by extension, the herald of his own condemnation. What would he do now? Go back? Impossible. The bear was there, an insurmountable barrier. Leave her. But she wasn't dying. She was recovering, under the protection of a force he couldn't fight. The image of his mother, her leg covered in mud and the bear by her side, etched itself into his mind. An indelible stain on his conscience, a living testament to his failure and to life's inexplicable strength. Fate, which he thought he controlled with an iron fist, had turned its back on him, handing the reins to a brown beast and a woman he had discarded. And the true monster, the son, felt the cold of loneliness and helplessness, while the bear, the wild one, brought warmth and hope. The forest air, once a silent accomplice, now seemed to vibrate with cruel irony, every rustle of leaves whispering the story of a crumbling plain. From his hidden position, the executive watched, paralyzed not by the cold that began to bite, but by the chilling understanding of his own impotence. The bear, that mountain of fur and muscle, was no longer a threat to his mother. It was a guardian, an imposing, warm shadow that defied all logic, every premise of his ordered universe. The scene etched itself into his mind with brutal clarity. His mother, once a burden, now rested with an almost serene stillness, her injured leg covered by the dark, healing mud. The bear, kneeling beside her, seemed a living statue of protection, its attentive eyes scanning the forest as if sensing the presence of the son, the true monster, lurking in the shadows. Every movement of the animal, every breath of its warm exhalation was a reminder of nature's indomitable force, a force he, in his arrogance, had underestimated. The initial disbelief transformed into a slow, corrosive nausea. He had planned every detail, every step to rid himself of that burden, that living memory of a past he wanted to erase. And now, nature itself, in its most untamed form, was undoing his work. His mother would not only survive, she was being cared for, protected by a creature he, in his calculating coldness, considered inferior. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but for the executive, the light was dimming in his own world. Shadows lengthened, transforming the forest into a labyrinth of distorted, menacing shapes. The cold intensified, but it was the psychological cold that invaded him, a terror unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't the fear of being caught, of being punished by human law. It was something deeper, more primal. It was the fear of disorder, of the chaos settling into his perfectly ordered universe. He had underestimated his mother's resilience, nature's unpredictability. He had played a game whose rules he didn't understand. The forest, once a silent accomplice to his crime, now seemed to mock him. Every rustle of leaves, every bird's song, seemed to echo the irony of his situation. He, the ruthless businessman, the architect of destinies, was now powerless, watching his own ruin unfold. The image of his mother, her leg covered in mud and the bear by her side, etched itself into his mind, an indelible stain on his conscience, a living testament to his failure and to life's inexplicable strength. Fate, which he thought he controlled with an iron fist, had turned its back on him, handing the reins to a brown beast and a woman he had discarded. He clenched his fists, feeling his nails dig into his palm, a physical pain that barely registered amidst the internal storm. The bear, the wild one, brought warmth and hope. He, the son, felt the cold of loneliness and helplessness. Darkness began to swallow the clearing where his mother and the bear rested. He needed to move, but his muscles seemed petrified, his mind in a loop of despair and denial. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, to erase that image, to rewrite the script. But the forest now was a stage where he was the captive spectator, forced to witness the unfolding of a play he had not written. The bear occasionally turned its head, and for an instant the executive swore the animal's eyes fixed directly on his hiding place, a gaze not of anger, but of an ancestral understanding, of a silent judgment. A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just an animal, it was the forest itself, nature itself observing him, evaluating him. He had thrown away his mother's life, and the forest had responded, offering her a new one. The irony was as dense as the mist beginning to rise from the forest floor. The executive took a step back, then another, his body moving almost by instinct, trying to merge further with the shadows. He couldn't stay there. He couldn't see what would happen next, couldn't bear the sight of that improbable connection, that wild healing. But he also couldn't simply leave, leaving behind the living proof of his failure, the seed of a nightmare that would haunt him forever. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own cruelty, a forced observer of a brutal miracle that condemned him. The forest whispered, and in every whisper he heard his mother's name, not as a lament, but as a song of triumph. And the bear, the brown guardian, remained there, an unwavering sentinel, the personification of wild justice, while the son, the true monster, felt the psychological dread of a fate he could not control. A fate that now seemed to be in the claws of a beast and a woman he had tried to erase. He was a ghost in his own story, an echo of a wickedness that nature had decided to correct. The darkness of the forest was not a veil, but a heavy hand, squeezing the executive, suffocating him. Every shadow dancing among the trees seemed to have eyes, watching him, judging him. The icy night air settling in was not the only cold that penetrated him. It was the cold of his own soul, exposed and vulnerable. He, the man who controlled empires, who dictated destinies in air-conditioned boardrooms, was now huddled, trembling, not just from the physical cold, but from the terror of a reality that defied all his understanding. The bear, that imposing mass of fur and muscle, remained there, an unwavering sentinel. Its eyes, once focused on the wound, now scanned the forest with a vigilance that transcended animal instinct. It seemed an ancestral wisdom, a patience the executive had never possessed. His mother, leaning against the tree trunk, no longer seemed the fragile, sick woman he had dragged to abandonment. There was a stillness in her expression, and acceptance that bordered on serenity. Her leg, once a macabre spectacle of blood and bone, was now covered by a dark paste of mud, a primitive but effective dressing applied by nature itself. The scene was a direct affront to his logic, to his calculated cruelty. He had imagined his mother wasting away, perhaps devoured, certainly forgotten. But there she was, not just alive, but protected, cared for by a beast he had underestimated, an animal that in its savagery showed a compassion he, the son, had denied. The irony was a slow poison, corroding every fiber of his being. How was it possible? How could the universe be so capricious, so cruelly just? He tried to move, but his muscles were stiff, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The smell of damp earth, of decaying leaves, once just a detail, now seemed impregnated with the essence of his failure. The rustle of dry leaves under his feet, every branch that broke, seemed like thunder in his ears, alerting the bear to his presence. He was an intruder, a predator who had become prey to his own conscience. Night advanced, and with it the temperature dropped drastically. The executive, dressed for a business day, not for a night in the wild forest, felt the cold penetrate his bones. Hunger began to gnaw at his stomach, a cruel reminder of his own vulnerability. He, who always had everything at his disposal, was now deprived, exposed, while his mother, whom he had abandoned to death, rested under the protection of an improbable guardian. With each passing minute, the image of the bear and his mother solidified in his mind, becoming an indelible tattoo. He tried to look away, to close his eyes, but the scene was etched on his eyelids, a waking nightmare. He wondered what the bear would do next. Would it stay there all night? And if so, what would happen in the morning? Would his mother be healed? Would the animal take her somewhere? The questions spun in his mind, each more terrifying than the last. for all of them implied that his plan had failed spectacularly. The silence of the forest was broken only by the nocturnal sounds, the distant croaking of a frog, the melancholic hoot of an owl. But for the executive, every sound was amplified, transformed into an accusatory whisper, an echo of his own wickedness. He was the monster, not the bear. The bear was the savior, the healer. The inversion of roles was so complete, so devastating, that it threatened to dismantle the entire structure of his identity. He had built his life on the premise of control, of power, of manipulation. Now he was impotent, a mere spectator of a miracle that condemned him. The idea that his mother could not only survive, but perhaps even find a new form of existence, a peace he could never offer, was unbearable. She, the woman he considered a burden, a relic of a past he wanted to bury, was being rescued by nature itself, while he, the son, was abandoned to his own darkness. A tremor ran through his body, not just from the cold, but from the vertigo of that revelation. He had tried to play God, and the forest had responded with a divinity of its own, older, more powerful. The bear, with its majestic presence and unexpected compassion, was the herald of this wild justice. He couldn't go back to the car, couldn't simply leave and pretend nothing had happened. The image of his mother and the bear would haunt him, a persistent shadow, a living proof of his crime and his failure. He was trapped between the desire to flee and the morbid need to witness the outcome, however painful it might be. The forest, once a silent accomplice, was now a tribunal, and he, the defendant, was being judged by the very life he tried to extinguish. The bear occasionally moved its head, and the executive swore the animal's deep eyes fixed on his hiding place, not with aggression, but with an understanding that made him feel naked, exposed in his cowardice. It was a gaze that seemed to say, "I see you. I know what you did." And in that gaze, the executive found not the fear of physical death, but the terror of moral annihilation, the condemnation of his own humanity. The night promised to be long, and every minute would be a torment, a penance imposed not by men, but by the relentless and incomprehensible order of nature. He was a ghost, haunted by the life he had tried to erase, and the bear, the wild one, was the guardian of his redemption, or his perdition. The cold of dawn began to intensify, and the executive's body, already exhausted, trembled uncontrollably. He hugged himself, trying in vain to retain some warmth, but the cold he felt was deeper than the air temperature. It was an existential cold, the emptiness of his own soul. The forest seemed to breathe around him, and every falling leaf, every snapping twig was a reminder of his insignificance, of his fragility before that primordial power. He was disarmed, not just of weapons, but of his psychological defenses, of his armor of control. That place, that night, was stripping him bare, revealing to him the true face of his cruelty and the futility of his plans. He was no longer the master of the universe. He was just a lost man, a coward, witnessing the miracle he had tried to prevent. His eyes, burning with fatigue and disbelief, were fixed on the unreal scene before him. The bear, a dark, furred colossus, did not move. It was there, a mountain of wildlife, protecting the woman he had condemned. His mother, leaning against the tree trunk, seemed to have found a peace she had never known in her urban life, an almost supernatural serenity. Her leg, once a macabre spectacle of blood and bone, was now covered by a dark paste of mud, a primitive but effective dressing, applied by nature itself. The bear, with a slow, deliberate movement, passed its rough tongue over the mud once more, not to clean fresh blood, but as if checking the integrity of its work, a seal of care before settling heavily beside her, forming a protective barrier against the cold and danger. With each lick, each adjustment of the animal's body, the executive felt an electric shock run down his spine. That was not a predator. That was a guardian. The bear's rough tongue, which should tear flesh, now caressed the mud-covered wound, an image of tenderness that tore at the son's soul. He expected the scream, the gushing blood, the brutal end. But what he saw was meticulous care, a compassion that made him question everything he thought he knew about nature, about life, about himself. The bear, which he expected to be the executor of his plan, had become the savior, the healer, and he, the son, the predator, was now huddled in the shadows, impotent, watching his own failure. The cold forest air seemed to whisper accusations in his ears, every rustle of dry leaves, every snap of a twig, a reminder of his cowardice. He smelled the damp earth, the decaying leaves, and the wild, earthy scent of the bear, a fragrance that would once be of danger, now was of protection. The irony was a slow poison, corroding every fiber of his being. He, the man who controlled empires, who dictated destinies in air-conditioned, well-lit boardrooms, was now deprived, exposed, while his mother, whom he had abandoned to death, rested under the protection of an improbable guardian. The idea that his mother could not only survive, but perhaps even find a new form of existence, a peace he could never offer, was unbearable. She, the woman he considered a burden, a relic of a past he wanted to bury, was being rescued by nature itself, while he, the son, was abandoned to his own darkness. A tremor ran through his body, not just from the cold, but from the vertigo of that revelation. He had tried to play God, and the forest had responded with a divinity of its own, older, more powerful. The bear, with its majestic presence and unexpected compassion, was the herald of this wild justice. The bear occasionally moved its head, and the executive swore the animal's deep eyes fixed on his hiding place, not with aggression, but with an understanding that made him feel naked, exposed in his cowardice. It was a gaze that seemed to say, "I see you. I know what you did." And in that gaze, the executive found not the fear of physical death, but the terror of moral annihilation, the condemnation of his own humanity. The night promised to be long, and every minute would be a torment, a penance imposed not by men, but by the relentless and incomprehensible order of nature. He was a ghost, haunted by the life he had tried to erase, and the bear, the wild one, was the guardian of his redemption, or his perdition. Dawn advanced, and with it the temperature dropped to unbearable levels for a man dressed for the office, not for the wilderness. The executive, huddled in his makeshift hiding place, felt the cold penetrate his bones, a cruel reminder of his own fragility. But the ice that paralyzed him was deeper than the biting air. It was the cold of his own soul, an existential void that expanded with each beat of his racing heart. He couldn't look away. His eyes, burning with fatigue and disbelief, were fixed on the unreal scene before him, an image that defied all his understanding of the world. The bear, a dark-furred colossus, did not move. It was there, a mountain of wildlife, protecting the woman he had condemned. His mother, leaning against the tree trunk, seemed to have found a peace she had never known in her urban life, an almost supernatural serenity. Her leg, once a macabre spectacle of blood and bone, was now covered by a dark paste of mud, a primitive but effective dressing, applied by nature itself. The bear, with a slow, deliberate movement, passed its rough tongue over the mud once more, not to clean fresh blood, but as if checking the integrity of its work, a seal of care, before settling heavily beside her, forming a protective barrier against the cold and danger. With each passing hour, the darkness seemed to thicken, not just in the sky, but within him. The executive tried to rationalize, to find a logical explanation for the bear's behavior, but there was none. It was a miracle, an anomaly, a direct challenge to his view of a controllable and predictable world. He, the architect of his own destiny, was now at the mercy of forces he could not even comprehend, much less manipulate. The smell of pine and wet earth, once just a detail of the forest, was now the scent of his condemnation. He felt his eyelids heavy, but fear and disbelief were more potent stimulants than sleep. Every fiber of his body was tense, awaiting a movement, a sound that would break the spell of that night. He watched the bear's slow, deep breathing, the gentle movement of its flank, and his mother's stillness beside it. She was alive, she was safe, and the one responsible for this was the animal he had expected to devour her. The irony was a sharp blade, twisting in his chest, cutting away every trace of his arrogance. He was not the predator, he was the prey, hunted by his own conscience, cornered by the truth of his monstrosity. The smell of pine and wet earth, once just a detail of the forest, was now the scent of his condemnation. He felt his eyelids heavy, but fear and disbelief were more potent stimulants than sleep. Every fiber of his body was tense, awaiting a movement, a sound that would break the spell of that night. He watched the bear's slow, deep breathing, the gentle movement of its flank, and his mother's stillness beside it. She was alive, she was safe, and the one responsible for this was the animal he had expected to devour her. The irony was a sharp blade, twisting in his chest, cutting away every trace of his arrogance. He was not the predator, he was the prey, hunted by his own conscience, cornered by the truth of his monstrosity. With each passing minute, the executive felt the gravity of his act deepen, like a swamp pulling him down. The cold of dawn, which had previously bothered him only physically, now seemed to freeze the blood in his veins, a chilling reflection of his own soul. He, the man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions, who decided the fate of thousands of people with a nod of his head, was now reduced to an impotent spectator, a cornered rat, watching the unfolding of a drama he himself had initiated, but which had completely escaped his control. The image of the bear, a mountain of fur and muscle acting as a nurse, a guardian, was a direct affront to everything he believed. The world, in his view, was a place of brutal competition, where the weak were devoured by the strong. He was the strong, his mother the weak. But there, in the damp darkness of the forest, this hierarchy had been grotesquely inverted. The wild animal, the epitome of brute force and nature's indifference, had demonstrated a compassion he, the son, had never conceived. The bear's rough tongue, which should tear, licked. Its claws, which should rend, were retracted. Its massive body, which should crush, was a shield. Every detail was a blow to his armor of cynicism, cracking it, exposing the fragility of his convictions. He felt a knot in his throat, a mixture of nausea and a strange, almost unbearable desire to cry. But tears did not come, only an emptiness, a hollow echo where an inflated ego once resided. The forest continued to whisper its nocturnal secrets. The wind moaned through the trees, and the rustle of dry leaves seemed to mock his insignificance. He tried to move, to stretch his numb legs, but the slightest movement seemed like thunder in the oppressive silence. The fear of being discovered by the bear was palpable, a constant shiver down his neck. Not the fear of being attacked, not any more, but the fear of being seen, of being judged by the animal that had become the mirror of his own moral failure. He wondered if his mother was conscious, if she felt the bear's warmth, its protection, if she understood the irony of the situation. He, the son who abandoned her, and the bear, the predator who saved her, the idea that she could wake up and see the bear as her savior, while he, her own blood, was the monster, was a torture that surpassed any physical pain. Hours dragged on, each longer than the last. The sky, once a blanket of pitch black, began to subtly lighten on the eastern horizon. A thin line of grey and purple announced the arrival of dawn. With the light would come clarity, and with clarity, perhaps, the need for a decision. But what decision? Flee. Go back to the car and try to erase the image of that night, or remain a witness to his own hell until the bitter end. His body trembled uncontrollably, not just from the cold, but from exhaustion and shock. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but the idea of food was repulsive. He was beyond basic needs, trapped in an existential limbo. His eyes, bloodshot and aching, did not stray from the scene. The bear, still motionless, was a statue of protection, and his mother, a small figure of hope beneath its shadow. The dawn light slowly crept through the forest, revealing the contours of the trees, the textures of the damp earth. Dew glistened on the leaves, and the first birds began to sing, a melancholic chorus that seemed to lament the executive's lost soul. He could see now, more clearly, the dried mud on his mother's leg, the bear's meticulous work. There was no more blood. The wound was sealed, protected. The bear, as if sensing the change in light, moved. A slow, deliberate movement that made the executive's heart leap into his throat. The animal raised its head, slowly turned it, and its deep, almost black eyes scanned the forest. For an instant that seemed an eternity. The bear's gaze fixed directly on his hiding place. There was no anger, no threat, only an ancient intelligence, an understanding that cut him to the bone. It was the same gaze as before, but now, in the nascent light, it seemed laden with millenary wisdom, a silent judgment that stripped him bare. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the bear could read every thought, every dark intention that had led him to that place. The animal did not growl, did not advance. It merely held its gaze, a wordless sentence, before turning its head back to his mother, as if its attention to the sun was just a brief diversion, a confirmation of an obvious fact. The executive was an intruder, a stain on the purity of that moment, and the bear, the guardian, was there to protect the life he had tried to destroy. Daylight was coming, and with it, the inevitability of a confrontation, not with the bear, but with the brutal truth of himself. He was on the brink of an abyss, and the forest, with its new day, seemed ready to swallow him whole. The dawn light, once a distant promise, now crept with intention through the forest, painting the tree trunks with shades of grey and gold. Each sunbeam filtering through the dense canopies was a blade, cutting through the darkness, and with it, the executive's false security. He was there, huddled, a shadow among shadows, but the arrival of day threatened to dissolve his disguise, exposing him to the naked truth of his cowardice. His eyes, burning with sleep deprivation and existential pain, were fixed on the scene that defied all his understanding of the world. The bear, a mountain of fur and muscle, was still there, hunched over his mother. The animal's breathing was a deep, rhythmic sound, a primordial melody that contrasted with the oppressive silence the executive carried within himself. The wound on his mother's leg, once a focus of dread and repulsion for him, was now the center of an attention that bordered on the sacred. He had seen the bear's rough tongue clean the blood, an act of wild hygiene that should have been brutal, but which revealed a shocking delicacy. Now, the bear moved again, and each movement was studied, laden with an intention the executive could not decipher, but which held him in morbid fascination. With a front paw, the bear scraped the damp, dark earth from the forest floor. It was not an aggressive gesture, but methodical, almost surgical. It mixed the earth with saliva, creating a thick paste, a natural poultice. The executive watched, his mind in a whirlwind. Mud? For what? His rationality screamed, trying to find a logical explanation. But his intuition, now awakened by horror, whispered something deeper. The bear was not just cleaning, it was healing. With the same frightening delicacy with which it had licked, the animal applied the mud paste over his mother's clean wound, covering it with a protective layer. It was a seal, a barrier against the outside world, a dressing made of the earth itself. Every gesture of the bear was a stab to the executive's soul. It was not just surprise, but humiliation. He, the rational human being, the son, had failed where the wild animal triumphed in compassion. The image of the bear, the supreme predator, acting as a nurse, a healer, was a direct affront to everything he believed about nature, about life, and, most painfully, about himself. His mother, once a burden, a weakness he had tried to eliminate, was now a protected being, revered by a force he had underestimated and disrespected. He felt the cold of dawn intensify, but it was a cold that came from within, an ice that spread through his veins, freezing his own humanity. The forest, with its morning sounds, seemed to mock his insignificance. The bird song, once a pleasant detail, was now a chorus of accusation. He was an intruder, a parasite, witnessing a miracle he had tried to prevent. With each passing minute, the daylight grew stronger, and visibility increased. The executive felt his hiding place become precarious, every dry leaf, every broken branch under his weight, a threat of betrayal. The bear, having finished its task, moved back a little but remained vigilant. Its deep, almost black eyes scanned the forest again. For an instant that stretched into eternity, the bear's gaze fixed directly on the executive's hiding place. There was no anger, no explicit threat, but an ancient intelligence, an understanding that cut him to the bone. It was the same gaze as before, but now, in the nascent light, it seemed laden with millenary wisdom, a silent judgment that stripped him bare. The executive felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the bear could read every thought, every dark intention that had led him to that place. He was not the predator. He was the prey, hunted by his own conscience, cornered by the truth of his monstrosity. The bear did not growl, did not advance. It merely held its gaze, a wordless sentence, before turning its head back to his mother, as if its attention to the son was just a brief diversion, a confirmation of an obvious fact. The executive was a stain on the purity of that moment, and the bear, the guardian, was there to protect the life he had tried to destroy. His mother, under the bear's protection, seemed calmer, her breathing more regular. The dark mud on her leg was a stark contrast to her pale skin, but it was also a sign of hope, of healing. The executive wondered if she was aware of her savior, if she felt the warmth of the bear's massive body, the security it provided. The idea that she could wake up and see the bear as her protector, while he, her own blood, was the monster who abandoned her, was a torture that surpassed any physical pain. Daylight was coming, and with it, the inevitability of a confrontation. Not with the bear, not anymore, but with the brutal truth of himself. He was on the brink of an abyss, and the forest, with its new day, seemed ready to swallow him whole. With each passing minute, the executive felt the gravity of his act deepen, like a swamp pulling him down. The cold of dawn, which had previously bothered him only physically, now seemed to freeze the blood in his veins, a chilling reflection of his own soul. He, the man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions, who decided the fate of thousands of people with a nod of his head, was now reduced to an impotent spectator, a cornered rat, watching the unfolding of a drama he himself had initiated, but which had completely escaped his control. The forest, with its secrets unveiled by the light, was no longer a place of business, but a tribunal, and he, the defendant, was being judged by the very life he tried to extinguish. With each passing minute, the executive felt the gravity of his act deepen, like a swamp pulling him down. The cold of dawn, which had previously bothered him only physically, now seemed to freeze the blood in his veins, a chilling reflection of his own soul. He, the man who orchestrated multi-million-dollar mergers and acquisitions, who decided the fate of thousands of people with a nod of his head, was now reduced to an impotent spectator, a cornered rat. Watching the unfolding of a drama he himself had initiated, but which had completely escaped his control. The forest, with its secrets unveiled by the light, was no longer a place of business, but a tribunal, and he, the defendant, was being judged by the very life he tried to extinguish. The morning air carried the damp scent of earth and decaying leaves, an aroma he would once ignore, but which now seemed impregnated with a raw, wild truth. He, who had always surrounded himself with luxury and sterility, was now immersed in the purest and most implacable of realities. His lips were dry and cracked, his throat raw, but thirst was a minor distraction compared to the aridity of his soul. The image of his mother, fragile and helpless, under the imposing protection of the bear, etched itself into his mind with the force of a lucid nightmare. How could he? How could the man who saw himself as the pinnacle of evolution, capable of dominating nature and the market, fail so miserably in his most basic humanity? His mother let out a low, almost inaudible moan, and the executive's heart stopped. The bear, which seemed to have entered a state of quiet vigilance, instantly raised its head. Its eyes, previously fixed on the sun, now turned with redoubled attention to the woman. The executive held his breath, his body rigid, every muscle tense. It was the moment she would wake up, the moment she would see. And then, what would happen? Would she scream, cry, or worse, would she recognize him? His mother moved slightly, a subtle tremor in her shoulders. The executive's eyes, wide, tried to penetrate the distance and foliage, searching for a sign, a confirmation. He could see the bear lean a little closer, its snout near her face, as if checking her breathing, her state. There was no aggression, only a protective curiosity, a concern he, the son, had never shown. Shame was a poison spreading through his veins, more potent than any physical pain he could feel. He remembered all the times his mother had protected him, from childhood falls to teenage tantrums. She was always there, a safe harbor, a constant presence. And he, in return, had thrown her away like trash, an inconvenience on his relentless journey to the top. The top of what? A pile of ashes now. The irony was cruel. A harsh laugh from the forest. His mother opened her eyes. Slowly, the executive saw. One eyelid lifted, then the other. Her eyes, clouded and confused, blinked a few times, trying to adjust to the faint dawn light. She looked up, at the sky that was beginning to lighten, then to the sides. Her gaze swept over the tree trunk she was leaning against, the damp leaves on the ground. And then her eyes met the bear. Time stopped. The executive felt his blood run cold. He expected the scream, the panic, the natural reaction of any human being before a colossal predator. But there was no scream. There was no panic. Only a gaze, an initial look of confusion which slowly transformed into something more. Surprise, acceptance, and for an instant, the executive swore he saw gratitude. His mother tried to move, but the pain in her leg prevented her. She let out a small groan of discomfort, and the bear, as if understanding, moved again, with a care that seemed impossible for an animal of its size. It scraped a little more earth with its paw, and with its snout, gently pushed it closer to the wound, as if to reinforce the mud dressing. His mother watched, her eyes fixed on the animal without fear. It was as if an invisible barrier had been broken, a silent communication established between the injured woman and her unexpected guardian. The executive felt a knot in his throat. That scene was a mirror, reflecting his own monstrosity. He had tried to kill her, and a bear was saving her. The truth, raw and brutal, was unbearable. He was the monster, not the bear, never the bear. The animal, the wild one, was the personification of compassion, of healing, of life, and he, the civilized, the rational, was the personification of death, of abandonment, of cruelty. His mother, with visible effort, extended a trembling hand, not to push, not to defend herself, but to touch. Slowly, her pale fingers approached the bear's rough fur. The animal did not recoil. It remained still, allowing the touch. And when the tips of her fingers brushed its flank, a shiver ran through the executive's body. It was a touch of trust, of acceptance, a touch that he, her son, had denied her for so long. Tears, which he thought had dried long ago, burned in his eyes again. They were not tears of sadness, but of a deeper pain. A pain that came from the understanding of his own moral failure. He was a stranger, an unwanted observer in a miracle he did not deserve to witness. The forest, now fully illuminated by the morning sun, seemed to breathe, to vibrate with life. But for him, it was a tomb, the tomb of his old identity, of his old soul. The decision he had postponed for hours now imposed itself with brutal clarity. There was no escape. There was no return. That place was his purgatory, and he was trapped in it, a witness to his own condemnation. That touch, that simple brush of his mother's pale fingers against the bear's rough fur. It was an electric shock that ran through the executive's body, more potent than any adrenaline rush he had ever felt in a high-stakes boardroom. It was not a touch of fear, nor of repulsion, but of a serene, almost reverent acceptance. His mother, her eyes still hazy, but now fixed on the animal, seemed to find a comfort that he, her own son, had ripped away from her. The bear, in turn, did not move. It remained there, a mountain of flesh and compassion, allowing the injured woman to find refuge in it. Its deep eyes, previously so focused on the executive, now softened as it observed his mother, as if validating her trust. The executive felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The scene was a distorted mirror of his own life. He, who always saw himself as the predator at the top of the food chain, the architect of destinies, was now reduced to an insignificant speck, a parasite hidden in the shadows, observing the purest form of care and connection. His mother, whom he had discarded as an inconvenience, was being rescued by a creature he considered wild and irrational. The logic of his world crumbled, piece by piece, with every breath of the forest. His mother's hand rested for an instant on the bear, and then, with visible effort, she tried to straighten up a little more against the tree trunk. A groan of pain escaped her lips, but it was not a groan of despair, but of a silent struggle for recovery. The bear reacted instinctively, moving slightly so she could lean against its massive flank. It was physical support, but also, the executive realized with a chill, emotional support. His mother, her brow furrowed with pain, but a glimmer of something new in her eyes, tilted her head, resting it gently on the bear's shoulder. It was a gesture of intimacy, of surrender, that the executive had never witnessed between her and any other living being, much less a wild animal. The sight was unbearable. Every fiber of the executive's being screamed in protest. He was the son. He should be the safe haven. He should be the protector. But he was the executioner, and the bear, the wild one, was the guardian angel. The irony was a sharp blade, cutting his soul into pieces. He remembered all the times his mother had sought him for a hug, for comfort, and he had pushed her away, too busy with his business, with his incessant pursuit of power and recognition. Now, she found that comfort in the arms of a bear. The morning sun already filtered through the treetops, painting the forest with golden hues and vibrant greens. The air was warmer, and the sounds of wildlife intensified. Birdsong, the buzzing of insects, the rustling of leaves. But for the executive, these sounds were a symphony of condemnation. Every note seemed to echo his failure, his monstrosity. He was trapped, not just physically in his hiding place, but mentally in a labyrinth of guilt and regret. He watched his mother close her eyes again, not in faint, but in a tranquil rest, supported by the bear's warmth and presence. The mud on her leg seemed to dry slowly, a protective crust over the wound. The bear, as if sensing the woman's need for rest, lay down beside her, its massive body forming a protective barrier against the world. It would not abandon her. No, it would not abandon her. This realization hit the executive with the force of a punch to the stomach. The bear, an animal, was demonstrating a loyalty and care that he, the son, had denied. The executive's mind reeled. He needed to get out of there. He needed to escape this scene that stripped him bare, that confronted him with the most brutal truth of his existence. But where to? To the world he had built, made of lies and empty ambition. That world now seemed so distant, so irrelevant. The forest, with its cruelty and wild compassion, was the only reality. He tried to move a muscle, but his body seemed paralyzed, heavy with the gravity of his actions. The fear of being discovered, of being confronted by his mother and the bear, was immense, but the fear of himself, of the monster he had become, was even greater. He was a spectator in his own tragedy, a ghost on a stage where life and death danced, and he had chosen the wrong side. The sunlight continued to rise, and with it, the relentless clarity of his situation. There was no longer any way to hide from the truth. The forest had spoken, and its sentence was clear. He was condemned to witness the miracle he tried to prevent, to see life flourish where he had sown death, and to recognize in the compassion of a bear the humanity he had lost. With each passing minute, the weight of his soul became more unbearable, a burden that no wealth or power could alleviate. He was there, cornered, at the mercy of the forest and his own conscience, waiting for the inevitable. With each passing minute, the weight of his soul became more unbearable, a burden that no wealth or power could alleviate. He was there, cornered, at the mercy of the forest and his own conscience, waiting for the inevitable. The sun climbed higher, filtering in golden beams that danced on the foliage, illuminating the scene with brutal clarity. Each ray seemed a spotlight on his own misery, exposing the truth he had tried to bury under piles of money and ambition. The executive felt his body rigid, his muscles aching from the forced position, but the physical pain was an insignificant whisper compared to the deafening scream in his mind. He watched his mother, now in a deeper sleep, her serene face resting against the bear's massive fur. The image was one of peace he had stolen from her, and which a wild animal now returned. The mud on her leg, dry and dark, was a silent testament to a healing he would never have provided. He was the son. He should have been the shield, the protector, but he was the wolf, and the bear, the feared predator, was the lamb. The inversion of roles was a slow torture. Each breath of his mother, each gentle movement of the bear, a dagger to his chest. He smelled the damp earth, the sweet aroma of decaying leaves, and the metallic smell of the fear that enveloped him. The bear, with half-closed eyes, seemed to watch, not just his mother, but the surroundings. Its head, previously low, lifted slightly, and its deep eyes scanned the forest with calculated slowness. There was no aggression, but a vigilance that made the executive hold his breath. Did the animal sense something? Did it know he was there, hidden, observing? Paranoia began to corrode his last defenses. He was an intrusion, an error in the wild harmony unfolding before him. The forest, once a backdrop for his crime, now became an implacable judge. Birds sang, but their songs seemed mocking. The wind whispered through the trees and seemed to carry his mother's unspoken words, the pleas he had ignored. He was thirsty, his throat dry, but he dared not move. The slightest noise could betray him, break the fragile balance of the scene. And then, what would happen? Would the bear attack him? Would his mother see him? The shame of being discovered, of being confronted with the monstrosity of his actions, was an abyss deeper than any forest cliff. He remembered a time, as a child, when he hid from his mother after breaking a valuable vase. She searched for him for hours, worried, calling his name. He remained silent, his heart pounding, until guilt crushed him and he emerged from hiding, crying. Now the situation was infinitely worse. It wasn't a broken vase, but a life, his own mother's life, that he had tried to break. And it wasn't out of fear of punishment, but out of a shame that transcended any physical pain. The bear, with a deep sigh that made the nearby leaves rustle, adjusted its position. Its front paw, enormous and furry, rested gently near his mother's head, an almost paternal gesture of protection. It was a guardian angel of fur and claws, whom he, the son, had replaced. The image was so powerful, so full of a wild and unexpected beauty, that the executive felt a pang of envy. Envy of the bear, which was capable of such compassion, of such purity of intention. His mind, once so sharp in business, was now a battlefield of regrets. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He had sacrificed everything, including his own soul, in pursuit of a power that now seemed empty and meaningless. True wealth, true connection, was there before him in the forest, between an injured woman and a brown bear. And he, the rich man, was the poorest of all. The sunlight continued to rise, and with it the relentless clarity of his situation. There was no longer any way to hide from the truth. The forest had spoken, and its sentence was clear. He was condemned to witness the miracle he tried to prevent, to see life flourish where he had sown death, and to recognize in the compassion of a bear the humanity he had lost. He was a ghost, observing the life he had denied, and the only thing that kept him there was the paralysis of terror and guilt. A small movement. His mother stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, and her eyes opened again. This time, there was no initial confusion. There was an acceptance, a calm. She looked at the bear, and a slight smile, a weak but genuine smile, touched her lips. She raised her hand, not to touch, but to rest on the animal's fur. The bear responded with a low growl, a deep, vibrant sound that echoed in the morning quiet. And then his mother's eyes moved, slowly, not to the sky, not to the trees, but to the general direction of where the executive was hidden. There was no focus, no recognition, but for an instant the executive felt that she saw him. Not with her eyes, but with some other perception, some intuition. The forest had awakened in her. He froze, his heart pounding erratically, awaiting the revelation, the accusation. But she merely closed her eyes again, the smile still present, comforted by the bear's presence. The tension was unbearable. The inevitable was approaching, and he knew he could not escape. That instant, that brief, almost imperceptible shift in her gaze. There was no recognition, no focus, but for him, it was a lightning bolt that struck him squarely. She felt him. She didn't see him with eyes blurred by pain and exhaustion, but she felt him with her soul, with that maternal intuition he always underestimated, always ignored. The smile on her lips, once a balm for his wound, became a dagger. A smile of acceptance, of peace that he had tried to steal and that she now found in the presence of a predator. The irony was a poison running through his veins, paralyzing him further. He was there, a specter, observing the life he had denied, and the only thing that held him was the paralysis of terror and guilt. The inevitable was approaching, and he knew he could not escape. The forest, once a refugee for his crime, now was an implacable mirror, reflecting the monstrosity of his actions. Every rustling leaf, every sunbeam penetrating the treetops seemed to whisper his name, his failure, his cowardice. The bear, a silent guardian, seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, the intensification of tension. Its eyes, previously half-closed in vigilant rest, opened completely. There was no aggression in its gaze, but a depth, an ancestral intelligence that made the executive shrink further into his hiding place. The animal scanned the forest with a slow, deliberate look, and for a moment, its eyes stopped exactly where the executive was. There was no growl, no sudden movement, just that gaze. A gaze that seemed to penetrate his soul, stripping him bare, exposing every lie, every selfishness, every act of cruelty. The executive felt a cold sweat run down his forehead, mixing with the dust and earth. His heart beat like a war drum in his ears, threatening to betray him with every thump. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. The fear of being discovered by the bear and the terror of being confronted by the mother he had abandoned. But the worst fear was of himself, of finally facing the empty, soulless man he had become. His mother, still with her eyes closed, sighed. A sigh of relief, of comfort, that contrasted brutally with the son's silent agony. The image of her, nestled against the bear's massive fur, was of a wild and moving beauty. The mud on her leg, now completely dry, formed a protective crust, a natural bandage that healed what he had wounded. He, the man who built empires with his hands, could not even staunch his own mother's blood. The bear, a wild animal, had done that. A fly buzzed near his ear, and he ignored it. Thirst was excruciating, his throat raw, but he couldn't move. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, for oblivion, but something held him there. Perhaps it was the need for punishment, the need to witness his own condemnation. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was a tiny spark of hope. The hope that, by witnessing this act of compassion, he could, in some way, redeem himself. But the idea was as fragile as a spider's web, and the guilt as heavy as a mountain. The bear, with a slow, majestic movement, raised its head again, its eyes fixed on a point beyond the executive, deep in the forest. A distant sound, almost inaudible to human ears, seemed to have captured its attention. A more intense rustling of leaves, a snapping twig. The executive felt a shiver run down his spine. Was something else approaching? Another animal, or worse, someone? The forest, with its deceptive beauty, was a stage for unexpected dramas. The bear let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated in the air and made the executive hold his breath. It was not a growl of aggression, but of alert, of protection. His mother, even in her deep sleep, seemed to sense the change. She moved slightly, nestling even closer to the bear, as if seeking refuge in its strength. The executive watched the scene, terrified and fascinated. The bear, the predator, was now the protector, and he, the son, the predator of his own mother. The sound in the forest became more distinct. Footsteps, not the light steps of an animal, but heavy, rhythmic steps, human. The executive's mind panicked. Who could it be? Hunters, forest rangers, or even more terrifying, someone looking for him? The world he had abandoned was infiltrating the forest, threatening to break the fragile sanctuary the bear had created. He felt an overwhelming urge to run, to hide deeper, to disappear. But his body did not respond. It was paralyzed, like a salt statue, condemned to observe the unfolding events. The bear, with surprising agility for its size, stood up, its eyes, previously fixed on the forest, now turned to his mother. It gently nudged her with its snout, a gesture that seemed to say, "Wake up. Danger approaches." His mother opened her eyes, sleepiness still present, but quickly replaced by a sharp perception. She looked at the bear, then in the direction it indicated. The executive saw fear in her eyes, but it wasn't the fear of being devoured. It was the fear of the unknown, the fear of being found, perhaps. The bear positioned itself between her and the origin of the sounds, its massive body forming an impenetrable barrier. It was ready to protect. The footsteps approached, and now voices, distant but undeniably human. The executive felt his blood run cold in his veins. It was the end of his escape, the end of his denial. He would be discovered, exposed, and the truth of his abandonment would be revealed to the world. And to his mother, shame was a fire consuming him from within, hotter than any hell he could imagine. He was there, cornered, at the mercy of the forest and his own conscience, waiting for the inevitable. With each passing minute, the weight of his soul became more unbearable, a burden that no wealth or power could alleviate. He was a ghost, observing the life he had denied, and the only thing that kept him there was the paralysis of terror and guilt. The bear growled, a low, guttural sound, a clear warning to whoever was approaching. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and the executive felt that time had stopped. The confrontation was imminent. The bear's growl reverberated not only in the forest, but in the executive's soul, a primordial alarm that cut through the fog of his denial. The footsteps, once distant and uncertain, were now undeniably closer, more defined. Voices, indistinct fragments, but unmistakably human, floated among the trees, carried by the morning wind. The world he had tried to leave behind was invading his sanctuary of guilt and cowardice. Panic seized him with icy claws. Who were they? Hunters drawn by the smell of blood? Forest rangers on patrol? Or, the most terrifying of possibilities, someone looking for him? The idea of being discovered there, a witness to his own abjection, was a torment that surpassed even the fear of the bear. He was naked, exposed, not only to nature, but to the society he had manipulated and from which he now fled. The bear, a mountain of fur and muscle, moved with surprising grace. It did not flee, did not hide. Instead, it positioned itself even more firmly between his mother and the origin of the sounds. Its head held high, its eyes fixed in the direction of the intruders. Every fiber of its being emanated an aura of unshakable protection. It was the personification of loyalty, a brutal contrast to the son who cowered in the shadow, a ghost of a man. His mother, awakened by the growl and the tension in the air, opened her eyes. The smile of peace had vanished, replaced by an expression of alert, but still without panic. She did not look at her son, but at the bear, a silent trust in her gaze. It was as if she knew that, at that moment, the animal was her only guardian, her only refuge. She nestled closer, not out of fear of the bear, but seeking the strength it radiated. The image of her, a fragile and injured woman finding security in the arms of a wild predator, was an implacable mirror for the executive. He who should be her protector was now the most dangerous predator of all. The footsteps became clearer, the rustling of leaves under human feet more audible. The voices now were almost discernible. One of them, deeper, seemed to call for something or someone. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The question echoed, laden with an innocence the executive felt like a stab. They did not know the drama unfolding there, the monstrosity he had committed. The executive felt a cold sweat run down his back, his throat dry and raw. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, to bury himself in the earth, to disappear. But the paralysis was complete. He was trapped, an impotent observer of his own condemnation. The forest, once silent and complicit, now seemed to conspire against him, amplifying every sound, every whisper, every frantic beat of his heart. The bear let out another growl, deeper, more menacing this time. It was a clear warning, a boundary that should not be crossed. The executive saw the animal's muscles contract, ready for action. The animal was prepared to defend the woman he had abandoned, to fight for her. Shame was a poison running through his veins, more potent than any physical pain. Then, a glimpse. Between the trees, he saw the silhouette of two men. Uniforms. Forest rangers, perhaps, or hunters. It didn't matter. They were there, and the truth was about to be revealed. The executive felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. His life, built on lies and selfishness, was about to crumble. He watched, his breath caught in his throat, as the two men approached the clearing. The bear, imposing and majestic, was the first thing they would see. and his mother nestled against it the second. The scene was surreal, a wild painting of compassion and danger. The executive closed his eyes for an instant, wishing it was all a nightmare. But when he opened them again, reality was even sharper, more implacable. The men were a few meters away, and their eyes now were fixed on the scene. One of them raised his hand, signaling to the other to stop. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the executive's erratic heartbeat. He saw the shock on the men's faces, the disbelief. They could not believe what they saw. An injured woman, protected by a brown bear. The logic of the civilized world crumbled before that primordial image. And then, one of the men, the one who seemed to be the leader, slowly reached for the radio on his belt. That gesture, that simple movement. The executive knew what it meant. The outside world was about to be alerted. The story would be told, and he, the son who abandoned his mother, would be exposed. The paralysis that held him began to give way, not out of courage, but out of an even greater terror. The terror of exposure, the terror of being confronted not only by the law, but by the mother he had betrayed. He felt an overwhelming impulse, a desperate need to act, to change the course of events, to prevent the inevitable. But what to do? Run, scream, reveal himself. Each option was an abyss. He was a ghost, observing the life he had denied, and now life was about to turn the tables, to confront him with the most brutal truth of all. The tension was a rope stretched to its maximum, about to snap, and he was at the center of the impending explosion. The forest ranger's gesture, his hand reaching for the radio, was a trigger. Not a shot, but the countdown to the explosion of his world. The executive felt the air thin, his blood run cold in his veins, panic transforming into a wave of nausea. It was no longer the fear of the bear, nor the fear of the forest. It was the terror of the truth, of exposure. That radio, a small plastic and metal device, was the bridge between his private hell and the merciless judgment of society. He saw the men's eyes, wide with disbelief, fixed on the surreal scene. The injured woman, nestled against the massive body of the brown bear, which protected her with the silent ferocity of a guardian. Logic crumbled. The predator was the savior. The son, the monster. Shame was a poison that burned every fiber of his being, more potent than any physical pain. The man with the radio, the leader, seemed to hesitate for an instant, his hand hovering over the device. His eyes swept the clearing, searching for an explanation, a context for that impossible image. And it was in that instant, in that suspended lapse of time, that the executive felt the paralysis give way. Not out of courage, but out of an even greater terror. The terror of being confronted not only by the law, but by the mother he had betrayed. An overwhelming, primitive impulse erupted within him. It was not to save his mother, it was not to redeem himself. It was to prevent, to silence, to erase the scene before it was etched into the world's memory. A hoarse cry, a sound he did not recognize as his own, tore from his throat and echoed through the forest. A cry of despair, of denial from a cornered man. The bear, until then a statue of protection, reacted instantly to the sound. Its head spun, its eyes fixing on the executive, who emerged from the shadows like a ghost. The growl that escaped the animal's throat was different now, laden with a wild fury, a direct threat. The bear saw not a son, but a new intrusion, a new danger to the creature it had chosen to protect. The forest rangers, shocked by the sudden cry and the bear's reaction, turned in the direction of the sound. Their eyes found the executive, pale, trembling, his eyes wide with terror and guilt. The scene was complete for them, a man hidden, observing everything. The truth, yet unspoken, hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. His mother, awakened by her son's cry and the rising tension, opened her eyes. She looked at the executive, and for an instant, their gazes met. There was no anger in her eyes, no immediate judgment, only a deep sadness, a painful understanding. She saw the monster he had become, and the torn soul he carried. And then she looked away, turning back to the bear, her true protector. The executive felt as if he had been stabbed. His mother's silent rejection, her preference for a wild animal, was a blow more devastating than any accusation. He was a stranger, an enemy, a predator in his own family. The leader of the Rangers, recovering from the shock, finally pressed the radio button. "Central, we have a situation here. I repeat, a serious situation. We've found an injured woman protected by a brown bear, and it seems there's a man involved. We need backup and a medical team immediately. Location, coordinate." The words echoed, cold and official, sealing the executive's fate. The world was coming. There was no longer anywhere to run, anywhere to hide. He was exposed, naked, before the forest, the men, his mother, and his own conscience. The bear, oblivious to human complexity, continued to growl, its eyes fixed on the executive, who was now paralyzed again, but in a different way. It was not the paralysis of the fear of dying, but the paralysis of condemnation. He had abandoned his mother to die, and now he was the one who was dying in his soul, in his reputation, in his humanity. The forest, once a sanctuary of secrets, was now a stage for revelation. The morning sun, which had once seemed to promise a new beginning, now illuminated the scene with cruel clarity, exposing every detail of his crime and his cowardice. He was a man who had everything, but who had lost the only thing that truly mattered, his soul. And the bear, the wild animal, had become the implacable mirror of his monstrosity. The silence that followed the radio call was filled only by the rustling of leaves, the bear's low growl, and the deafening sound of his own broken heart. The end had come, and there was no escape.